Hello, this is Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest with a new episode of the Three Questions podcast. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm really pleased today to have a fantastic oil industry analyst and commentator, Sergey Vakulenko, who is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace after really decades of work as an economist and industry official and consultant in the energy industry, including with Royal Dutch Shell and IHS Sira. Many years ago, also at Gazprom Neft, the kind of oil division of the Russian state gas company Gazprom. So somebody with really an in-depth knowledge of energy markets generally and Russia's energy markets specifically. I'm very excited actually to talk to Sergey today about the Ukrainian strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure, especially its oil infrastructure. So Sergey, thank you so much for being with me today.
Pleasure is mine. Glad to join you.
I've been following your work for many years now and certainly encourage others with interest in Russia's energy sector and oil sector to do the same. You've been, arguing for some time now, that first the sanctions and more recently, Ukraine's strikes have been making, life difficult for Russia, but at the same time, not really threatening in any fundamental way the future of Russia's oil sector or, more broadly, kind of the sustainability of the revenue that's driving or at least substantially contributing to Russia's war effort. And I'm just wondering, we've been seeing a real intensification of the Ukrainian strikes recently. There's very much kind of this race on the one hand between, Ukraine's ability to build and launch drones, and on the other hand, Russia's ability to shoot them down and where necessary, to make repairs. You touched on this actually in one of your recent papers on all of this. I'm just wondering, has your view evolved at all over the last couple of months as we've seen the Ukrainian strikes really intensify? And, we've started to see, certainly in some places in Russia, especially in Crimea, gasoline shortages.
Let's put the subject of sanctions aside. But
Sure,
if you
sure.
open my very first article on the Ukrainian attacks on Russian refining infrastructure, and there was like half a dozen of them since 2024, all of them were ending with a sentence like, so far it's hindrance, inconvenience, some pain, but not yet at the scale where it makes a difference. So, however, if Ukraine manages to scale up and increase the scope, the tempo, the frequency, and the amount of explosives each attack delivers to every particular refinery, then it would change. So every time I was saying that this might have a potential to grow into something much more significant. However, at the point I was commenting, this wasn't the case. Every time I've got quite a lot of flack about it, last summer included. Well, however, a couple months later, you would see that, well, that particular campaign would end and Russia would continue refining. That if there would be a fuel crisis like there was one in 2025, of course, no near the scale it is now, it would be making by Russian government, like there were fuel crises long before the war. So from time to time, Russian government tries to introduce some price controls, just the same way as many city governments try to have rent controls, and with exactly the same effect. You get a shortage. So that's what they kept doing, walking on the same rakes. What we're observing now, since April, there was a major scale up at the amount of drones Ukraine launches at Russia. It seems like there is a step change, a quantum leap. So now At the very least, Ukraine can plunge Russia into full-blown energy crisis or gasoline crisis. On the other hand, we need to keep in mind that in undisturbed state, Russia pushes 5.3 million barrels per day of crude through its refineries. At the last count, it was somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million barrels per day lately. And it's actually a rather oscillating number because, again, as you said, there is a race. Ukraine keeps hitting refineries, Russia keeps putting back into operations at least some of the refineries that were hit. So capacity goes up or throughput goes up, throughput goes down. So now we are observing a situation where private motorists mostly facing a lot of problems. It starts to influence their lives. It hasn't started yet influence Russian economy substantially. Definitely, it hasn't started to influence yet, at least, Russian ability to fight.
Yeah, right. So that's kind of a question where I wanted to follow up a little bit, maybe in a couple of ways, and maybe first on Russia's ability to fight. For people who aren't following, Russia's oil sector really closely, how does the amount of gasoline and I guess for that matter, diesel probably for trucks or tanks or whatever. How does the quantity that the Russian military needs to pursue its operations compare with the total amount that's available in Russia? Military needs, I imagine, would be, relatively small compared to the economy as a whole.
Indeed. And we got to look at the way this war is being fought at the moment. Russian military mostly runs on diesel, and Russia produces almost twice as much diesel as it consumes. So it was exporting something like 45% of diesel it was making. I've used the wrong verb. Apparently, the word doesn't run, it crawls. So it's not a situation where you see hundreds of tanks going on 200 miles per day marches, something like this. So you don't see any World War II style or Desert Storm huge tank onslaughts. It's much more like World War One. So, and the front line moves by meters. Still, you need fuel. Still, you need fuel to bring all those drones to the front lines. Still, Russian infantrymen tried to get to their positions with light motorized vehicles. Well, the drones get to fly on some sort of energy, but this level of consumption is nowhere near what you would see or expect to see from a large motorized army operation 10 or 20 or 70 years ago. So they still do have problems, but these are logistical problems. They might facing problems with delivering the fuel they need. And with the level of control Ukraine has over supply lines, it could easily be a situation that they need to send out like 5 times more fuel than the front line actually needs in a hope that 20% would make it to the front line, while the rest would indeed be killed, destroyed by Ukrainian drones. But still, that's the amount Russia could easily marshal to supply its front line. So it's probably less than 10%, maybe even less than that the army uses. But
So
again, I'm not an army analyst,
no, no,
so
no, no,
you
no.
better
I,
ask my
I
friend.
I understand. Kind of flipping over to gasoline, where it seems like the bigger problem is at this point for Russia. Russia has kind of a variety of options. Make reduce demand for gasoline, being one, either through administrative measures or by making it more expensive, or alternatively, trying to find ways to get more gasoline by importing it. How viable are those options for Russia?
By the way, there's third mechanism which we can discuss.
Oh yeah, no,
Uh,
please, please.
right. Making it more expensive, well, let's the market decide and let's price rise destroy demand. This goes against the grain of the policy Russian government was pursuing for many, many years. So there are price controls, gasoline prices were suppressed, There were price rises over the last few months, but still it's less than dollar a liter. So compared to Europe where I live, where even in not so affluent countries, it's easily more than $2 a liter, there's a long way to go. And it's a long way to go for the prices, for demand to start to get destroyed. Albeit the need to stay in line with not guaranteed results does force some people abandon their cars and get back into buses, subway, and like. At least there's quite a lot of public transportation in Russian cities. Russian countryside is a different matter, and it's actually less fuel that finds its way to the countryside than to the cities. So people living there are in truly difficult situation. But looks like, at least for now, they are relaxing those price control rules, allowing prices to rise. Importing, they've already started importing. And again, if Ukraine, for example, doesn't make any of its own refined fuels, because Russia destroyed Ukrainian refineries early in the war. When Ukraine was trying to restore them, they hit them again and again. Ukraine gets virtually all of its fuel from neighboring countries. But Ukraine is a smaller, less numerous, more compact nation, and it has willing suppliers. So it's easy for Russia. Where will we get it? Well, yes, there's China. China is a mighty refining center. Until very recently, though, exports of refined products were banned just because of the China was managing its demand and other for the Hormuz crisis. Looks like these bans have been relaxed, so Russia might get some respite from supplying its Far East area, but the fuel crisis is not in the Far East. Fuel crisis in Central Russian European part, and that's several thousand kilometers away. So that's difficult. You could deliver something by ship. Well, it takes you 6 weeks to deliver crude to India, 6 weeks to deliver gasoline from India to Russia. One of the largest Indian refineries, Nayara Energy, in fact, it's one of the largest refineries in the world, is owned by Rosneft. And Rosneft is, well, the Russian state-owned oil company. State-controlled, it's partially floated. Rosneft is trumpeting its story that, yes, we will be supplying Russia with gasoline from our overseas operations, and they will. It wouldn't be instant. It wouldn't be huge, though. So it would be difficult to alleviate all the needs Russia has. There is a trusty neighbor of Belarus, has two refineries, could supply some gasoline to Russia, but then again, that would probably compensate for a loss of one refinery. Ukraine regularly targets a dozen and a half, if not more. So it's very difficult for Russia to compensate that. The third mechanism I was mentioning or alluding to is as following. As I said, Russia made like 70-80% more diesel than it needs. With gasoline, the safety margin is much lower. It's about 10-15%. However, Russia makes quite a lot of naphtha, light distillate that gasoline is made of, but to make modern quality Euro 5 standard low sulfur unleaded gasoline, you need to push it through rather sophisticated chemical machinery in the refineries, which were never built. So Russia actually has, when you're talking about straight run gasoline, there is about 60-50% surplus. A third of it is being exported as straight run gasoline, and it becomes feedstock for petrochemicals that could be relatively easily converted into low quality gasoline. High amount of sulfur, something that was customary 25 years ago in the 90s, with high proportion of octane boosters, some of them thrown upon today, but were okay 25 years ago. And if you mix this low quality Euro 2 class gasoline with the modern Euro 5, you get something that's Euro 3 or maybe even Euro 4 in terms of sulfur and concentration of the wrong octane boosters. So that's what they're going to do. And the good thing is, you could convert that naphtha feedstock into a lower grade gasoline, not necessarily in refineries, but in tank farms or fuel depots.
For Russia, I mean, it sounds like it's kind of manageable and lower grade, just to be clear in the context we're talking about here. Kind of sounds like you're saying dirtier. Sort of more environmentally impactful and maybe a little bit less efficient also. Is that what you mean?
High proportion of sulfur.
Yeah.
So Yes, you get more acid rain, and it's not as powerful fuel. The ethers you add into gasoline, they're containing some oxygen. They produce less energy when they're burned, and they tend to leave some tar on the innards of the engine and like. And sometimes it could cause, well, particularly if used for prolonged period of times, some oxidation issues in your flow lines and so on. Again, it's
Okay.
not drastic.
Right,
It's
right. It's a kind of a coping mechanism.
indeed. If you have a luxury of not having that, well, you'd probably do it, but
Yeah.
it's
Right, 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 right.
uh, there are many other ways of making air quality much worse or destroying nation's car fleet than what I've described.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, maybe moving on kind of to my second set of questions, and we bled into this already to some extent, but Ukraine, at least as I see it, seems to be, kind of trying to make life more difficult for the Russian military by making it harder for them to have fuel. And you talked about that already a little bit, actually at some length, the need for Russia to send to the front, probably a multiple of the fuel that they actually need, because Ukraine is going to destroy some of it. Ukraine, I think, clearly is also trying to reduce Russia's revenue because oil is and oil products are kind of important, export revenue generating commodities, and as you know, I'm sure better than I do, important tax generating commodities for the Russian government. And we didn't talk too much about that yet. Thirdly, there seems to be on the part of Ukraine kind of this political strategy of trying to make ordinary Russians feel some inconvenience or pain from the war, not really approaching the level that many citizens of Ukraine are feeling, but also striking at the Putin government's effort really to try to shield most Russian citizens from any real, material consequences from the conflict. I think we probably already talked enough, about the military piece, but I wonder what thoughts you might have. Is Ukraine getting close to having sort of a significant economic impact on Russia or a sort of a significant social political impact on Russia, or is that still a ways away?
Well, let's dissect the economic angle. As Russian refineries plunged, we saw Russian crude oil exports skyrocket by pretty much the same amount. So, whatever oil couldn't get to the refineries that were down made its way to its export ports. So, it would be exported as diesel, fuel oil, and other things. So, when exported that way, Russia would also get refining margin. Now, they can't export a basket of products, but they still can export crude. That's a loss of like $10, $15 a barrel, something like that. But you don't lose the full value of the barrel. For a few months, Russia was reaping the effects of Hormuz war. Now the oil prices are back to where they were before the war. Well, they were a couple days ago until there was yet another
Right, right.
escalation in Hormuz.
Another round of strikes. I've been, sorry to interject, I've been at times calling it a quantum war or sort of a quantum peace. We kind of have peace, but we don't have peace at
Right.
the same time. But
Schrodinger piece, right?
anyway, please continue.
Right. So for a while, indeed, Russia was reaping those fruits quite a lot, quite abundantly. Now, much less so, but at least as volumes of crude goes or volumes of Russian oil production, they might reduce here and there. Usually, say a company which refines a lot of its products suddenly is left with much less refining capacity. It would be difficult for it to organize in a very short period of time a lifting of its crude. And for that reason, it might have to curtail production. But on country scale, production has been curtailed. The Russian government levies its oil taxes at the wellhead. So, in that sense, the government is somewhat indifferent. So, Russian state finances are not in good shape at all. Russian economy, after 4 years of war, finally gets into crisis, and Russian government can collect the taxes that it was planning it be collecting in its budget, but it has little to do with oil revenue. It's just the general state of Russian economy after 4 years of war.
The cost of the war
Indeed.
and all of the money that's building things that get blown up instead of building things that contribute to growth. That's
And labor shortages
and right,
and
right, right.
sanctions effects and
Hmm.
so on and so
Sure,
forth.
sure, sure, sure,
That,
sure.
that would be subject of another 33 questions.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. Well,
But
so how about
with
the
oil,
social political, the social
With oil,
political
however, if this fuel crisis becomes deeper, what could eventually happen is that logistics would start to suffer. And of course, if goods and people can be moved around, then, well, your manufacturing suffers, your commerce suffers, and like. Still, there is a vast grid of railroads.
Mhm.
Still, commercial road transport runs mostly on diesel. Diesel, it's not been in shortage yet, at least. People can get to their place of work by trams, metro lines, trolleybuses, you name it. So it's not that Russian cities are in a standstill. Eventually, things might start to get worse. The modern consumer economy that runs on road trucks delivering goods from rather far away parts of Russia and distributing them through supermarkets and shopping centers and like, this already starts to run into certain problem. So tensions start to surface, but we're not there yet. And the last element, whether people are definitely seriously displeased about this. And indeed, they suddenly start to feel that, well, the war is real and it does influence their lives. They kind of just go about their lives thinking that, yes, their nephew might be in the army, their niece's husband could be killed, and there's something like that. But, well, they see drones hitting into far away from the frontline Russian cities. They start to feel fuel shortages and so on. Most of them would actually like for this war to not be in there. They would like the war to stop. Whether they'd be prepared to pay a price, for example, that they will have to retreat all the way from Russia and abandon all the territories that Russia occupied since 2014, Crimea included, not so sure. There is still this, psyche. So, what all the sacrifices over 5 years were for them? They definitely wouldn't support bidding for peace that would include some sort of reparation, something like that. So definitely pain level is not there that most Russians would support peace at any price. They don't think that that's the prospect that we have to
Right.
agree with.
Maybe then, Sergey, moving to my last set of questions here. If we kind of zoom out a little bit from the Russia-Ukraine war and look just more at the global picture and Russia's place in it, and how, first of all, how the global oil sector is kind of evolving, but derivative of that, how does that affect Russia? Kind of looking ahead at that industry, and in global oil generally, we have all kinds of things going on. First and foremost, of course, you mentioned earlier briefly the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the U.S. war with Iran and the impacts from that. We've got China, which has emerged as, the really by far the world's largest energy consumer and a major force in markets as a result of that. We've got sanctions, we've got climate policies and efforts to electrify, vehicle fleets, which have a little bit receded into the background, under pressure of geopolitics, but still very much out there. how do you see the future of Russia's oil industry with all of those conditions? And, kind of also bearing in mind that, I mean, this war will eventually end one way or another. Wars do. But, when it does, there's going to be, a Russian energy industry that for an extended period of time has faced sanctions and now increasingly physical damage, presumably hasn't gotten the same level of investment that it might otherwise have received and the same kinds of technology that might otherwise have been employed. Is Russia going to be behind or, struggling to compete in global markets? Do you think Russia can rebound quickly from this? I'd be very interested in your views.
Again, it's a long and an interesting subject. Where we are really, say 5 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, there was a belief, and quite a few analysts would agree to that, that the oil age is not necessarily over, but this end is nearing, and having very few petrol cars left by 2050 is quite plausible. Now, the belief is more like we're not at a peak yet. Peak is probably peak oil demand, that is probably a few years away, and then you would not see a precipitous drop, but probably a plateau and a slow slide down from the demand. And the last petrol cars, it's definitely not 2050. It would be good if it's 2065 or something like that, or 2070 and so on. For many years, starting from 2014, really, there was underinvestment in upstream oil production almost everywhere in the world. So, yes, there are huge investments in US shale, which have actually slowed down. Everywhere else in the world, there was underinvestment. So, there are actually some worrying voices asking, well, we thought that we had more oil production capacity than we need. There might be a concern that it would be stranded assets. Well, now, could there be a case that actually you need to invest quickly, at least not to be at the mercy of Persian Gulf producers? Well, they have enough capacity, of course, but even them need to invest. Even them were suspected of, well, under drilling during those lean years of 23, 24, when OPEC had to cut its production. If you look at Russia, on one hand, Russia still has billions and billions of barrels of reserves. On the other hand, Russian pipeline funnel of projects that would be ready for development or ready for development in, say, 3 to 5 years is absolutely empty. And it has been empty since like 2016, 2017. So in Russia, we also are looking at 10 years of underinvestment. So, yes, we have brownfields, lots of them. These brownfields still have quite a lot of production left in them. But what we could expect now from Russia is a long term secular decline, not precipitous, 3% per annum, sometimes maybe 5% per annum, sometimes arrested to 2% per annum, but long and steady decline. There still are reserves in Russia. Russia possesses something quite similar to US shale. Geologically, it's different, but when it comes to the way exploited, pretty much the same. However, the technology hasn't been developed for it. There's not, Russia doesn't possess a huge drilling and fracking fleet needed to quickly ramp up this operation. If the conditions are right, Russia has the expertise. Russia knows how to do it, but it will take 5 to 10 years to reverse this decline trajectory to get Russia out of the rut that it currently is. Why is it so? I'd invite our listeners to read my long read on Carnegie. Sorry for advertising. But I think that's explained in there in much more detail than you'd allow me here.
I would be quite interested in the detail, but we also obviously have to limit the conversation a little. I encourage everybody to go to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace website and look up Sergey, and you can find a longer piece there that addresses that question. Maybe just to ask one final thing on this point, and then to wrap up, there's like the technology question. And are there other kind of non-Western energy companies around the world, assuming that Russia's relations with, European partners in the United States may remain kind of complicated for some time, and that might limit the role of companies from those countries in Russia's oil sector in the future. Does Russia have it indigenously, or is it able to get, from China or elsewhere, the kinds of technology that they would need in the oil sector? You mentioned fracking. There are also, like enhanced oil recovery to kind of maintain the production at some of these older oil fields. Some of the projects that Russia might need to develop to continue to exploit its reserves. They're in sort of geographically challenging places, or deep offshore, or the Arctic, or is Russia going to be able to handle that?
When it comes to deep offshore, Russia's out of its water, out of its depth. Well, sorry for the pun. Never really had a chance, never really had a need to develop that competence. So yes, they're tapping their toes into some of these projects, but they were experimental. When it comes to working in this huge Siberian field with water flood, so on, Russians know what they're doing. And most of the people who used to work for Schlumberger, Weatherford, and Halliburton in Russia, they are in Russia. So these companies, they've abandoned their oilfield services operations, but even 5, 6 years ago, they're staffed mostly by the Russians. So the equipment is there. The engineers and technicians are there. When you look at what had happened, the length of horizontals, the number of fracking stages after the departure of the Western oilfield services, all these went up. You wouldn't see any particular degradation in the upstream segment of what was going on. When it comes to developing the Bazhenov shale, you'd need a step change in there. Sure. You can buy Chinese made fracking fleets and heavy drilling rigs for the job, and they know how to drill 5,000 feet horizontals. They know how to make 12 stage, 20 stage fracking in these horizontals. Yes, that's not enough. But then, to be honest, going from tiny little open hole horizontal to this 5,000 feet horizontal, or from one stage fracking to 12 stage fracking, is much longer distance than other stages. So they can catch up on that.
Sergey, thank you so much again. For listeners. This is Paul Saunders, the Three Questions podcast, just with a very deep, rich conversation with Sergey Vakulenko, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a really very experienced, impressive expert on global energy and also Russia's energy sector. So, Sergey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for having me here.